and do not meet a terrorism or national security threshold. For example, Islamist and neo-Nazi groups in Britain are operating lawfully, but they advocate and work towards the replacement of democracy with an Islamist or Nazi society.
And he set out some of the far-right groups that may end up on the list of extremists.
I am sure that we would agree that organisations such as the British National Socialist Movement and Patriotic Alternative, who promote neo-Nazi ideology, argue for forced repatriation, a white ethno-state, and the targeting of minority groups for intimidation, are precisely the type of groups about which we should be concerned and whose activities we will assess against the new definition.
He then turned to Islamism and the groups that might be listed.
Organisations such as the Muslim Association of Britain, which is the British affiliate of the Muslim Brotherhood, and other groups such as CAGE and MEND, give rise to concern for their Islamist orientation and views. We will be holding these and other organisations to account to assess if they meet our definition of extremism.
Dominic Casciani is our Home and Legal Affairs correspondent.
So this definition, Sarah, has been kicking around government for an awful long time. I mean, Tony Blair was the first to have a go at this after the 2005 suicide bombings in London. And the first proper definition we got officially in public was in 2011, and that said that extremism is the vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law and individual liberty, mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. And this was mocked awfully at the time. I remember somebody in counter-terrorism saying to me, they may as well say it's not a British value if you go on the beach and without wearing a hanky on your head. It was so nebulous. And Michael Gove, I think in fairness to him, has had real concerns about this for a long time, certainly when he was in the Department for Education in the early years of Cameron. He talks about this kind of stuff, and he's effectively trying to strike while he still can, to try and tighten this up and to give what he sees as some rigour to government, saying, look, if we're going to engage with groups, can we be clear who we're engaging with? So this new definition is very much in the light of that, telling civil servants and other ministers, think about the people you're engaging with. So the new definition, extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance that aims to negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of others, undermine, overturn or replace the UK system of liberal parliamentary democracy and democratic rights, or intentionally create a permissive environment for others to achieve those results. Now that's very wordy, but in effect what it comes down to is if you're dealing with a group which is trying to stop other people lead their lawful lives in the UK, are they an extremist group? And it doesn't necessarily mean they have to be involved in violence. Now that's where it gets very subjective. So I'll give you an example here. There are a couple of groups that Michael Gove named today in the House of Commons. Now there's a couple of far-right groups which aren't banned under terrorism legislation, but when you look at the stuff they're putting online, it's pretty grim at times. And he says those are the kind of far-rights we're going to look at. And then on the Islamic end of this, or the Islamist end of this, to talk about Islamist politics, he said that the British affiliate of the Muslim Brotherhood, the international global organisation, that's a group they want to look at as well, because they are basically pushing versions of intolerance or effectively pretty strident and radical views which basically rub up against democracy and individual rights. And in theory, his officials are going to work through this list, and then at some point somebody's going to get on this list and there'll be a rubber stamp saying you are extremist. And at that point, in theory, ministers will then stop dealing with these groups. They won't get public cash, they won't get platforms, they won't be able to influence policy, and that's kind of how it works.
Dominic Casciani. The crossbench peer Lord Walney is the government's advisor on political violence and supports the government's new definition on extremism. I asked him what's different from the old one.
I welcome the fact that the government is now going to try to focus more directly on the element of undermining liberal democracy. I think the last definition was well-intentioned, and I agree with it, but the broadness of it, by fundamental values, by the number of things which are listed as part of it, it was very difficult to understand how to put that into practice.
Who would you expect to be affected by this new process?
Well, if you will forgive me, I'm not going to name organisations because I think the reason why we have got a framework being announced today and then are expecting it to be followed up by organisations who are actually properly named is that this is a really difficult process and it's very important to get it right legally. I'll give you an example. In the recent past, the Labour government took a decision that a statement that had been made by a senior figure at the Muslim Council for Britain, which had been deemed to be supporting Hamas's terrorism back in that day, meant that the government should no longer engage with the MCB.
A couple of months ago, the MOD said it would end its relationship with the Muslim Council of Great Britain. So it would appear to be current, but we know that that organisation during the pandemic really helped to communicate public health messages.
None of this is easy, and that I gave you that particular example as I think it was clear. It was clearer probably back in 2008, and now it's the question of passage of time.
So if they were put on the list, because we didn't. I mean, there was obviously action taken by the government without the list. Now there's going to be a list. If the Muslim Council of Great Britain ends up on that list, will you think, yep, that's okay?
If you ask me to make a decision on should that organisation or any other be on the list right now, well, it depends on the evidence that's set out.
Would you expect most of the organisations and people on the list to be Muslim?
I don't know. Will they be exclusively Muslim groups that have levels of Islamism?
Most of them, I'm picking
I don't think
that hesitation.
Well, I don't know. I mean, let's wait and see. I do think there is a significant issue in our country with some groups who purport to speak for significant parts of the Muslim community that have in the past had links with individuals or organisations that are Islamist, which is a particular term distinct from the faith that the vast majority of Muslims preach, but it is in direct opposition to the idea of a liberal democracy.
Do you think it's going to make any difference to the protests on the streets of London?
I don't get the impression that the main organisers of the protests are in consideration. I want the police to have either the confidence or clearer powers to be able to take a holistic view about what is happening in our capital.
Keir Starmer said yesterday that when he was being challenged about an anti-Semitic Labour Party, he said that you're talking about an old party. The current Labour Party isn't like that. Do you agree with him?
He has done a significant amount to root out anti-Semitism in the party since he's been leader, and there is a much greater level of confidence from the vast majority, I think, of Jewish people in the Labour Party and looking at the Labour Party. The debacle over the Rochdale by-election shows that we are not there yet. There is a significant amount more to do, and the fact that a Labour candidate voiced that appalling anti-Semitic conspiracy in an audience and was not challenged, there were other senior Labour people there, shows that there is a lot more to do. And actually, I think there is something of a parallel between the approach that many of us took when we saw extremism taking over in the Labour Party, to challenge it, not to seek a kind of false unity that swept these issues under the carpet for fear of making a fuss and upsetting people. That was actually, in hindsight, the right thing to do in the Labour Party, and I think it's the approach that we should take to the UK now on the wider issue of extremism in our society and in our communities.
Lord Walney speaking to me there. Well, I also spoke to Sadiq Khan, Labour Mayor of London, and I asked him whether he would be using the new definition.
I'm concerned about the last few days and how we've led to where we are today, that Michael Gove and the Conservative Party are seeking to create a dividing line between the Conservative Party and everybody else. Look, the threat of violent extremism is a serious one and a real one. It's why I've said to the government they're wrong to be cutting by 2/3 the amount of money they invest in the scheme called Prevent. You've got this new definition from Michael Gove, which I fear is going to divide communities, send people underground, rather than us having the opportunity to debate with them, to educate them, and to bring them on the right path.
So does that mean you won't use it?
We'll have to wait and see the details of the list he publishes. My concern is some of the people we engage with in some of our programs, which works with young people, whether it's those who may be going down the path of the extreme far right, whether it's those who may be going down the path of, in inverted commas, the Islamist. And my worry is, by labelling these groups, many local authorities, mayors, public authorities won't engage with them, and they'll go underground.
Do you think it will be mainly Muslim groups who end up on this list?
I think the concern that many Londoners I speak to, from the Islamic community, particularly post-October the 7th, we've seen an increase in rhetoric from this government in relation to, for example, pro-Palestinian protesters being labelled, inverted commas, hate marches. We've seen more and more examples of Home Secretaries, present and past, using language that inflames tensions, and I'm nervous that what Michael Gove will do, intentionally or unintentionally, is for him to answer, is lead to a situation where many Muslims think it's them and us.
But there is a difficulty, which is that at the moment there are the protests that we see most weekends, where there are areas which, and for some Jews, they feel that they can't go to parts of London. They're being described as no-go areas for Jews. Has London become a place where at certain times, on a Saturday, on weekends, when there are protests, Jews can't go in those areas?
Well, London is not a no-go area, but it is the case that there are some Jewish Londoners I've spoken to, friends actually, colleagues as well, who do feel frightened, and that's a fact. That's their experience.
And should the police be interfering and intervening more in the way that the protests are being managed?
Well, the police since October the 7th have made hundreds of arrests in real time, and often afterwards once they've got evidence. I tell you what's made it a lot harder with so few police officers is in the past the government's recognised that as a national international capital city, because there are so many protests in London, the Met Police Service needs more funding for more police officers, and the government's funding the Met Police Service
So if there were
£240 million
more police,
lighter.
If that's interesting, if there were more police, if the police were better funded, would the protests be policed differently, and perhaps in a way that where you didn't see anti-Semitic posters?
I would absolutely like more resources from the government. I've doubled the funding from City Hall. We've lost £1 billion from the government. And if we had more resources, not just in terms of the cuts, but also the £240 million we've lost as a national and international capital city,
would you answer the second part of my question?
Do more.
Okay, and this goes to the central core of it. Do you think the policing of the protests is acceptable, or should it be stricter?
No, I think the police have operational independence, which I support. I think they're doing a good job under difficult circumstances. I think if the government was serious about the issue of extremism, they'd be invested in Prevent rather than cutting money from Prevent. If they were serious about wanting to make sure that any crimes that they've been committed that weren't investigated they'd be invested more in policing. I'm quite clear that we're in danger of conflating different issues.
I
think we're in danger of...
And that's because, I wish to explain, Lee Anderson, I mean, let's try to put aside the language that he used, but he said that what he was trying to get...
No, but you can't. Let's share the language he used. Why are we running away from it?
No, I'm not running away with it, it's just that we've gone over it before and you have responded to it. And I was just, because he claims that the message he was trying to get across was one of incompetence. And he said that, judging by his inbox, thousands, if not millions, he said, agree with what I was trying to say. And his particular charge was about the way that policing, that the protests are policed, and your role in it. And you're right, I mean, he said that Islamists have control of the London mayor.
Well, let's deal with this in stages, because I think we've got to do justice to a very serious point that you've raised with me about senior politicians using not just tropes and generalisations, but lazy untruths about somebody because of their faith, their ethnic origin. What he said was not just Islamophobic and anti-Muslim, but it's also racist. It's also important to explain to listeners that the Mayor of London has no operational influence over the police. The Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, who the last time I checked wasn't a Muslim, is in charge of policing in London. But his faith is an aside. What the Commissioner must do and the police must do is police based upon the evidence they have and laws that are broken. If Lee Anderson was questioning the policing of the protests, I would argue that it's unreasonable for him to choose the mayor and not the Home Secretary, and I'd question, is that because of the mayor's faith and ethnicity rather than anything else?
Given all that we're seeing lately, whether it's Lee Anderson's comments, Frank Hester's comments, charges, of course, of anti-Semitism. Frank Hester's were against Diane Abbott is suspended from the Labour Party because of comments a year ago that was seen as anti-Semitic. How dangerous is the country at the moment as a result of all this rhetoric?
I think it's possible to say at the same time, our country is a wonderful place to be if you're an ethnic minority or a religious minority. I'm the Mayor of London, and I'm not just a ethnic minority, I'm a religious minority. The Prime Minister is both an ethnic minority and a religious minority. So on many criteria we're doing remarkably well. But it's also the case that I believe there's a hierarchy of racism in our country. Some things are rightly unacceptable, and we call them out in real time. Others are allowed to, stand. So you've got a situation where, more than 2.5 weeks after Lee Anderson said words that were clearly Islamophobic, anti-Muslim and racist, Rishi Sunak, the leader of the Conservative Party, is either too weak or doesn't understand that they're Islamophobic and anti-Muslim, and is failing to call them out for what they are. I'm really pleased that 24 hours afterwards, Rishi Sunak did call out Frank Hester for his clearly racist and misogynistic comments. But it's wrong. I'm somebody who in real time called out...
Are Muslims at the bottom of that hierarchy?
That's the impression that Muslims have. That's the impression
and who's at
that
the
we
top?
have. Well, there's not. My point is there should be no hierarchy. This is the whole.
Yes, but you said there is a hierarchy. So if you
That's
say
the
that,
perception
what
there
does
is.
get called out?
I think not enough gets called out. What we've got to make sure is that things are called out. There should be no hierarchy, whether it's racism against black people, against Jewish people, against people who follow the faith of Islam, whether it's Indian people. We should call all those things out. And by the way, we should also call out hatred against other people because of things out of their control, whether it's their sex, whether it's their sexual orientation or other matters.
Can I ask you just a personal question? Because you've had to have the kind of a very high level of police protection. Can you give us an idea of when conversations like this flare up? And Diana Abbott referred to it this morning. Every time that she's in the media, she knows she will get a spike in abuse. Does that happen with you?
I'm afraid it does. And look, neither Diana Abbott or myself is looking to play the victim card here. But the reality is there is a direct link between language certain people use, things certain people say, and the hatred directed towards us. And that's why I think we've got to be cognizant. It can't be part and parcel of being a politician that you take this risk. But if you're a black politician or a Muslim politician, it's even worse.
When Diane Abbott referred to different types of racism, she was suspended by the Labour Party, and you said they were simply unacceptable, her comments. That was a year ago. Do you think she should now be readmitted to the Labour Party?
Look, Diane Abbott is somebody I've known for many years. She's somebody who's been a social justice activist for many years, and I admire her. What she said on that Sunday was wrong. That letter she wrote was wrong.
And she's apologised. Do you think she should now, a year on, be readmitted to the Labour Party?
But I think the Labour Party has an independent process. I think they should look into whether she can return to the Labour Party based upon her apology, based on what she said and done. It's not for me to decide what happens. I think it's right and proper. That's the independent process.
Michael Gove has mentioned, among others, MEND, CAGE and the Muslim Brotherhood. What are your thoughts on those being on the list?
I simply don't know enough about those particular organisations and what the criteria is for them being on those lists. I think the important thing is for Michael Gove to explain why those particular groups are on the list, and I'm sure there'll be other groups as well who want an explanation of how they got on that list and how it's possible to get off that list if they can show they don't deserve to be on there.
Sadiq Khan talking to me a little earlier. Coming up in the programme, we discuss the sometimes awkward topic of death and hear a defence of slugs. If you get in touch, social media, hashtag BBC Watto, WATO that is. Our email address is worldatone@bbc.co.uk. Cancer patients in Gaza say they're not being allowed to leave through the Rafah crossing to Egypt for the life-saving treatment they need, despite their names appearing on authorised evacuation lists. In parallel, fees charged by an Egyptian company arranging evacuations from Gaza have rocketed during the war, becoming unaffordable for most people. The BBC's Lara El-Gabali reports.
I'm on my way to the border crossing. Hopefully, I will find my name there and be able to travel, God willing.
This is Sihem's third time trying to leave Gaza. She was being treated for leukemia when the conflict began, leaving her and almost 10,000 other cancer patients without treatment.
I read that my name was published on the Rafah coordination groups. My name was published on the departure list twice. I have been to the crossing point twice for no reason. I was turned away.
Her name was on an evacuation list for Turkey in November, but Sihem was turned away by Palestinian border agents who told her that the Turkish envoy wasn't ready to receive her. But we found that that wasn't the case. Mona has breast cancer and was on the same list. She was allowed to leave for Turkey that day and could even bring her 2 daughters.
After I got through the crossing onto the Egyptian side, I saw the Turkish consul waiting for us, and I knew I was going to Turkey.
We've spoken to 2 other cancer patients who have been turned away at the border despite their names being on the official evacuation lists. Only 600 cancer patients have been able to leave Gaza since October 7th, even though Turkish officials told us that they could be treating hundreds more if they made it into the country. Israel vets who leaves Gaza and claims that it has no restrictions on the number of patients who can leave for medical treatment. The Palestinian border authorities, who are responsible for managing the crossing, didn't respond when we asked for comment, but it seems that others have found another way out. A lucrative market has emerged since the war started. An Egyptian travel agency, Hala, is charging Palestinians up to $5,000 per person to exit Gaza within 2 weeks. That's more than 4 times the annual salary in the Strip. This man says he had to pay an employee an extra $300 to get his family on the evacuation list. He didn't want to be identified, so we've changed his voice.
They weren't letting anyone. If you wanted to go in, you had to pay to be let in. So then you could pay the $5,000. The fee was $5,000 for an adult and $2,500 for a child for Palestinian passport holders.
He is one of 10 people who told us they made extra payments of up to $4,000 to Hala employees to get their families evacuated. But it seems the best connected in Gaza can leave without paying at all. We found the names of Palestinians on an evacuation list meant for Egyptians. One of them told us they were helped to leave Gaza by someone with political connections. Neither Hala nor the Egyptian Foreign Ministry responded to our questions. In Gaza, time is running out for Sihem, whose cancer is spreading.
We are suffering now. My medicine is finished. I'm so tired. I can hardly see in front of me. No blood tests or anything. My chemotherapy ran out a long time ago.
Without the money or connections, many patients like Sihem have been left behind.
Lara El-Gabali reporting. Jason Ashley, who's a head teacher in Southampton, has gone viral with his letter apologising to parents for the quality of his school's lunches, which he called unacceptable. He blamed the catering company at the school, Chartwells, over which he said he has no control. Well, it started a conversation about whether local authorities should hire external companies to provide school meals. Here's what Mr. Ashley had to say. Federation, a group of 3 local authority schools in Merton in southwest London. The schools were also catered by Chartwells until they decided to go their own way. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Sarah.
Well, tell us what happened, first of all.
Yeah, so it was back in 2021. The children were coming back after lockdown, and I was working in the schools at the time. And anyone who works in schools ends up in the lunch hall at lunchtime and serving children food. And these were hungry children. These were children who, like the school in Southampton, they don't come from wealthy backgrounds. They were struggling to find food, and they were turning down the food we were offering them, and it was very worrying. I tried some of the food, and some of it was uneatable. It was really unpleasant, not tasty, didn't look great, and there was very little we could do as a school because we were stuck in a contract with Chartwells at the time.
Okay, now I should say, Chartwells have said to us, we're sorry to hear about the feedback about the historic contract. The experience doesn't reflect the high standards we have across the business. The contract ended 3 years ago. And they said, in terms of our approach, our meals are developed in line with the school food standards, which I guess, with the wage level within a contract determined by the funding allocated by the school. What did you decide to do?
Well, we decided to come out of the contract. So our local authority were tendering at the time, and we let them know that we didn't want to go into a new tender, because I don't think it's one individual company. I just think actually the whole model is really difficult, because it's really hard to feed children, especially 1,000 children a day. That's what we're feeding at our schools, and it's really hard to do that as a big business. Actually, this is a local issue, and we decided that we'd have a go ourselves, which was really scary, and we were put off from doing it because not that many schools do it. It seems a huge task, and it took quite a bit of courage by the governors at the time and imagination by the staff in the school to think we could do it differently.
When you say do it ourselves, what do you mean? Who's doing the cooking?
So, well, actually, it's exactly the same people doing the cooking. So all the staff that were working for Chartwells were tupied over into our school. We pay them directly. We made sure they were put on really good employment contracts. They have access to our pensions and things. And they were upskilled because they'd been de-skilled because of the system and because of the structure. And they were allowed to cook what they wanted.
I know I'm chasing you through this, rushing you through the story, but tell us what was the effect? What's the food like?
Well, the effect is the food's much better. The children are eating more vegetables, more fruit than ever before. They're happy. You can't educate a hungry child, and now we don't have hungry children because we're able to give them the food that they want and they need to be healthy and for their well-being. So it's been great. It's been hard, but it's been really
more expensive?
Worthwhile. Of course, it's more expensive, and food prices go up, or the oven explodes, and you've got to sort it out as a school. But it's worth it because the children are getting the food they need. So it's not really a cost you can really begrudge.
Rachel, Chris, thank you so much for talking to us. Now then, England's health ombudsman says we need to get better at talking about death. Rob Behrens is concerned that the reluctance to talk about end-of-life care can result in traumatic consequences for patients and their families. And he wants conversations about end-of-life care to be normalised, not least so that families can properly consider things like do not resuscitate orders. Well, to consider our approach to death, we're joined by Amber Jeffrey, who's the founder of the Grief Gang podcast and mentor, and by Dr. Sarah Holmes, who's a consultant in palliative medicine and the medical director of Marie Curie. She also works at the Marie Curie Hospice in Bradford. Good afternoon to you both.
Hi there. Hello.
Amber Jeffrey, how did you get into this whole idea, not least of doing a podcast on grief?
I know, it's not really a career path. I think when you grow up you think I'm going to start a career in grief, right? So my story is hello, thank you Sarah for having me on today. My story dates back to 2016 when I was 19, freshly turned 19, and my mum, Sue, suddenly died of a heart attack, was just here one day and gone the next. And being so young and bereaved amongst my peers, I was quite an anomaly. I was quite a rarity. I had no other peers who had experienced this, and I essentially suffered for 3 years of not getting the support that I needed and really seeing an example talking about grief. So fast forward 3 years later to 2019, I said, I've had enough and I want to talk about it. I had so much in my head and in my heart to do with my grief, to talk about my mum, and so I just went, what's the best form? Perhaps a podcast. And it was the best thing I ever did with my life. I have learned not only about my grief, but how we as a society and my community and how we grieve. And to talk about grief, I think essentially, as I'm sure we'll get into, is to talk about deep love and to talk about our people. So, advocates talking about grief, so I'm really pleased that the Health Ombudsman has rallied for that too.
Okay, let me bring in Dr. Sarah Holmes here, because in a way, I mean, Amber's talking about grief, but what the Ombudsman in a way is talking about is a reluctance to talk about death, so it's before somebody's actually grieving. But do you think it's all wrapped up in a reluctance that we just don't want to consider our mortality?
I think that's right, Sarah, yes. You know, we are all going to die, sadly, and we all know that in the back of our minds. But we don't always want to face that, and I think people worry about conversations being upsetting. As Amber says, you know, it comes from a place of love. People don't want to upset people that they love by talking about death and dying. But as Amber's experience has highlighted, really, actually talking about it can actually prevent people having problems and struggling with grief after the event. So at Marie Curie, we feel very strongly that it's really important that we have these conversations early with people.
Amber, in the conversations that you've had about your grief, I mean, do you think that even because you were so young, one can't, and your mum was young, so I would be surprised if she would have been having conversations about. Do you think there is a way that just it can become part of just more normal social chat?
I think, yeah, I mean, when I reflect on the conversations with my mum, obviously with my mum it was a sudden death, so there really was no room to talk about, you know, when I die, what I want for my own life, at my end of life. There was, you know, we just, from one day to the other, just thrusted into this world of grief. But I think what sort of changed for sort of, I guess, my generation, if I reflect on my mum's life and how we spoke about death and dying in our household, it was quite non-existent. But I think what really fueled me to want to talk about grief, death and dying was the fact of being so young and experiencing this. I thought, I wasn't meant to be experiencing the death of my mum until maybe perhaps 20 years later. But no, I've arrived a little bit sooner. And there's just no blueprint for this. And I think to touch on the